Over a century after the Titanic sank beneath the icy waters, divers and researchers have recovered artifacts once lost to the depths, offering an eerie yet fascinating glimpse into that tragic night. In this video, we'll take you through 15 incredible artifacts recovered from the Titanic wreck that are guaranteed to leave you terrified. Number 15. Wallace Hartley's violin. This violin was a relic gotten from the sunken ship that interested a lot of people. It belonged to Wallace, who was the bandmaster on board that led the 8-piece orchestra that famously played as the ship was going down. While chaos broke out and passengers scrambled for lifeboats, Wallace and his bandmates stayed in position, trying to bring calm to the panic around them. According to several survivors, they played music till the very end. No one knows the last song they played for certain, though many believe it was "Nearer, My God, to Thee." Either way, the image of that band playing on while the ship slipped into the sea has become one of the most powerful and lasting scenes from the entire tragedy. Years later, in 2006, Wallace's violin was found in an attic in England. It was inside a leather case, remarkably preserved for something that had been through so much. On the back of the violin, there was an inscription from his fiancée, Maria Robinson. She had given it to him as a gift, a small but meaningful reminder of home. That engraving helped confirm the violin's authenticity after years of testing and debate. Afterwards, the violin was exhibited in the same shipyard where the Titanic was built. In 2013, the violin was auctioned off in England for £900,000, which is a staggering $1.7 million. Number 14. Wooden deck chair. This wooden deck chair is one of the few pieces of Titanic furniture that made it back to land in one piece, and this isn't just any chair. This particular Nantucket-style chair once sat proudly on the first-class promenade deck, reserved for the wealthiest passengers as they enjoyed the ship's amenities and watched the ocean views in luxury from the top. When the Titanic sank, most of its furniture was engulfed by the Atlantic. Bits of wreckage floated on the surface, scattered and drifting across the freezing water for days. The recovery ship Minia, sent out to retrieve bodies, found more than just human remains. Among the wreckage, they found pieces and debris of the ship's wooden structure, splintered furniture, and this chair. It was worn and weathered but still intact. Years later, when it went up for auction, it attracted significant attention. In 2015, the chair sold for £85,000, which was about $110,000, to a UK-based collector with a taste for iconic pieces of history. The auctioneer, Andrew Aldridge, reflected that the deck chair wasn't just significant because it was a relic of the Titanic, but because of how much interest was still put in the ship even after it sank over a century ago. And really, what's more iconic than a front-row seat to one of the most talked-about tragedies of the 20th century? Number 13. Alligator skin purse. This finely crafted purse was recovered from a leather suitcase found in the wreck, and it likely belonged to a 63-year-old woman named Marion Meanwell, a third-class passenger and hat maker from England. From the look of the purse alone, you can tell she had an eye for style. The thick hide, the quality stitching, and the subtle shine of the alligator leather wouldn't have been something picked up from just anywhere. Marion was someone who knew fashion, and this purse quietly spoke volumes about her taste. Inside the purse were two small but deeply personal items: a landlord's endorsement and her medical inspection card, which was a prerequisite for all third-class passengers who were lucky to be on board. This was proof that there weren't any diseases across the borders of the U.S. They may not sound like much, but those documents tell us that this trip meant something bigger to her. Maybe it was a fresh start, or maybe she was looking to grow her business overseas. However, according to the director of collections for the company that now owns the remains of the Titanic, Thomasina Ray, she said she was on her way to America to visit her daughter, who recently lost her husband. Also, she initially wasn't supposed to be on the Titanic. In fact, she was supposed to sail on the Majestic, but was rerouted onto the Titanic unfortunately. What's truly remarkable is how well the purse held up after spending decades on the ocean floor. Experts say it was the tannins in the leather that helped preserve it. The same qualities that made it luxurious in 1912 helped protect it all these years later. Number 12. A baby's shoe. How does a pair of baby shoes end up amongst the ruins of the Titanic? The discovery was heartbreaking. This is one of the smallest yet most emotionally powerful artifacts ever recovered from the Titanic. The pair of shoes was found near the wreck site and originally traced to an unknown child, whose body was pulled from the Atlantic by the recovery ship Mackay Bennett. The crew, hardened men who had seen a lot, were deeply shaken by the sight of this young boy, no more than 2 years old. He had no identification, no one to claim him, and nothing except the clothing on his body and a pair of tiny leather shoes. The sailors, moved by what they had found, came together to do something rare. Using reward money they received from Vincent Astor, the son of John Jacob Astor IV, whose body they had also recovered, they paid for a proper burial for the little boy. They bought a small white coffin, placed a copper pendant inside that read "Our Babe," and gave him a headstone. On May 4, 1912, the child was buried in Halifax Fairview Lawn Cemetery, Nova Scotia, with a crowd of strangers standing in as his family. However, the baby's shoe was given to a police officer, Clarence Northover. He held on to the shoes hoping someone would claim them, but no one did for a very long time. While he waited, he kept the shoes in a desk drawer at the police station until his retirement 6 years later. For years, no one knew who he was. Then in 2002, almost 90 years after, the baby's remains were exhumed. Forensic experts who underwent DNA testing suggested the boy might have been Aino Viljami Panula, a Finnish third-class passenger. That conclusion stood until 2007, when more advanced testing confirmed his identity as Sidney Leslie Goodwin, a 19-month-old toddler from England. He and his entire family had been traveling in third class, hoping to start a new life in America, but unfortunately, none of them survived. Today, that tiny leather shoe is on display at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Halifax. While the child left behind a shoe, another unidentified man left behind a hat. Now it's time for today's topic. During a routine expedition to document and recover small artifacts from the wreck of the Titanic, a Discovery Channel deep-sea drone captured footage that left the entire crew shaken. At nearly 12,500 feet below the surface, the drone's floodlights scanned the debris field when the cameras froze on something unexpected. A porcelain doll's head, half buried in the silt, its face eerily intact. What unsettled the team wasn't just the sight of the hollow eyes staring back through the darkness, but the condition it was in. Experts know that most delicate objects at those depths deteriorate quickly under crushing pressure, saltwater corrosion, and microbial activity. Yet this doll looked unnaturally preserved, as if time had barely touched it in over a century. The discovery sent waves of unease through the crew. Some speculated that unusual chemical conditions on the seafloor might have prevented decay, while others whispered about something far stranger. How could such a fragile object survive when metal and wood around it had long since rotted away? Within hours, the recovery mission was suspended. Officially, the explanation was caution over disturbing a historical site. But those present admitted privately they left out of fear, terrified not by what they had found, but by what its survival might truly mean. Number 11. Amy's bracelet. This beautifully made bracelet was found hidden away inside a Gladstone bag that had most likely been in the purser's custody. The bag itself was waterlogged and damaged from years of being in the ocean. Regardless, inside it was a piece of jewelry that instantly caught the attention of the expedition crew who found it. The bracelet was made of 15-karat rose gold with an almost pure silver overlay. In the center, the name Amy was delicately written in script and set entirely with diamonds. Based on the quality of materials and craftsmanship, experts believe it must have belonged to a first-class passenger. Whoever Amy was, the bracelet says a lot about her. This wasn't a simple or casual accessory. The design shows real precision and care, and the materials were gold, silver, and diamonds. These weren't just expensive. They were the kind only the upper class could afford at the time. The way the gold and silver were layered gives the bracelet a soft shimmer, a contrast that brings out the lettering in a subtle but unmistakable way. Whoever designed the piece of jewelry was an expert that was skilled in their craft, and they had to be really expensive. What makes Amy's bracelet even more fascinating is the context it was found in. The Titanic, as luxurious as it was, also carried a massive amount of wealth in its cargo, estimated to be over $200 million in diamonds and gemstones alone. Many of these pieces belonged to first-class passengers, and most of them were never recovered. Amy's bracelet is one of the rare exceptions that wasn't on display. Rather, it was stored away, protected inside a bag, while the owner struggled while the ship sank. Despite the bracelet's beauty and the clear indication that its owner was someone of high status, Amy's identity remains unknown. Till today, no passenger records have definitively matched the bracelet to a name. So while we have this breathtaking artifact, we don't have the story behind the woman who wore it. Amy's bracelet remains a stunning piece of history that is still wrapped in mystery. Number 10. Perfume vials. In 2000, Dick Barton, a salvage expert working for the company that owns the Titanic wreckage, was on a mission before stumbling across a small leather pouch. He immediately took the pouch to a lab to run some tests on it. These tiny glass perfume vials did not only survive the pressure of being underwater for decades, they still smell the way they did over a century ago. He described the scents as floral with hints of lavender. Later on, researchers from Eastern Michigan University took a closer look at the perfume bottles, and that's where they found 3 separate satchels of 65 vials of perfume oils marked with the name Saalfeld. These delicate vials once belonged to Adolph Saalfeld, a first-class passenger and a successful perfume merchant from Manchester, England. He was traveling aboard the Titanic with a leather satchel containing hundreds of scent samples. likely hoping to expand his business and open up a new outlet of floral fragrances in America. When the ship hit an iceberg, he was in the smoking room and went back to his cabin. While in a haste to leave the ship, he left his perfume sample. Luckily for him, Saalfeld made it off the ship alive, but his luggage didn't. It sank with the Titanic, settling into the deep-sea mud for over 70 years. When the bag was eventually recovered during an expedition, experts were shocked to find that many of the small perfume vials inside had remained sealed. What was even more surprising was that the original 1912 scents were still intact. When researchers uncorked a few, the fragrances poured out, letting out a strong, sweet, floral, and spicy scent exactly how they would have smelled on a London shop counter back in the Edwardian era. Number 9. John Chapman's pocket watch. This is one of the most hauntingly personal items recovered from the Titanic, belonging to John Chapman, a second-class passenger traveling with his new bride, Lizzie. They had boarded the ship in Southampton, full of hope, ready to begin a new chapter in America. What they didn't know was that their story would end in the cold Atlantic, and their love would become part of Titanic's unforgettable story. On the night the ship went down, Lizzie was offered a seat in Lifeboat 4. But when she realized John wouldn't be allowed to join her, she turned to her friend Emily Richards and said quietly, "Goodbye, Mrs. Richards. If John can't go, I won't go either." Moments later, both Lizzie and John were swept into the sea as the ship broke apart. Her body was never recovered. John's body, however, was found days later. In his pocket was his watch with its hands frozen at 1:45 a.m. This was likely around the time that John Chapman and his wife were swept overboard and drowned, as the ship finally sank beneath the surface almost an hour later. In 2009, the watch was put on exhibition and is now being displayed at the Titanic Honor and Glory exhibition at the National Maritime Museum in Falmouth, Cornwall. Number 8. A life vest. This wasn't a replica or a prop. It was the actual life vest worn by 18-year-old Madeline Astor, the young wife of one of the richest men on board, John Jacob Astor IV, who were on their way home. Madeline was 5 months pregnant at the time. She and her husband had been on a long honeymoon in Egypt and were heading back to America aboard the Titanic. He was 48 while she was barely out of her teens. When the ship struck the iceberg, Astor reportedly helped his young wife into Lifeboat 4, reassuring her that he would follow on another. That moment was the last time she ever saw him. John Jacob Astor IV didn't survive the sinking. His body was later pulled from the ocean, while Madeline, floating in the freezing night, made it out alive with the help of this very vest. Carpathia's senior assistant to the doctor, Gottlieb Rencher, was at the passage of the quarterdeck helping survivors aboard and brought Mrs. Astor into his office to rest, where she took off her life jacket. And when she was okay, she left it at the office. For many years it was in the possession of the Rencher family, who eventually donated it to the Titanic Historical Society. Today, it's displayed at the Titanic Museum in Springfield, Massachusetts. Number 7. Key to the crow's nest locker. This key has been one of the most controversial pieces of the Titanic. It was literally the missing piece needed to avoid the ship being wrecked. Now, that might not sound like much at first, but inside that locker were the binoculars meant for Titanic's lookout crew. The interesting thing was that the key never made it aboard in the first place. It belonged to Second Officer David Blair, who was reassigned at the very last minute before the ship sailed. In a rush, he forgot to hand over the key to the officer in charge. This meant that the crew in the crow's nest, including Lookout Frederick Fleet, didn't have access to binoculars on the night of the collision. Fleet later testified that if they had the binoculars, they might have seen the iceberg sooner. A single key, almost the size of an index finger, carried weight in one of the most disastrous nights in maritime history. When the key resurfaced decades later, it reignited another conversation about the survival chances of the passengers of the ship if the mistake was avoided. How could something as simple as this little object change the fate of over 1,500 people? In 2007, the key was put up for auction and sold for a whopping £90,000, which was around $116,000 at the time, which went to an anonymous telephone bidder. Number 6. Plan of the Titanic. Even though it wasn't glamorous or personal, it played a major role in both the Titanic's operation and its investigation after the disaster. It wasn't a decorative item or a souvenir owned by any of the passengers on the Titanic. It was a working blueprint and document which was 32 foot long that showed everything from first-class suites to engine rooms, crew quarters, and even the third-class dormitories hidden away in the lower decks. Originally, this plan was used by the Titanic's crew to help direct passengers and staff across the vast and complex vessel. With over 800 feet of length and multiple decks to navigate, guests, especially those in first class, often needed assistance getting from their cabins to dining salons, smoking rooms, or the Turkish baths. The crew relied on this plan to make the ship feel less like a maze and more like an actual floating hotel. One example of this plan was found inside a purser's locker, surviving the years after the sinking. It was a map of the class system itself that literally depicted the ship's class divisions. And after the Titanic went down, this blueprint became more than a guide for investigators to look into. During the 1912 British Board of Trade inquiry into the disaster, the massive plan was unrolled and used in the courtroom. Investigators traced the ship's structure to understand how the iceberg hit, how the flooding spread, and why so many lives were lost. It gave a technical view of the tragedy, stripped of the emotion but full of answers. In 2011, this exact plan was auctioned off and sold for a jaw-dropping £220,000, which was roughly $284,000. At the time, it set a world record for Titanic memorabilia. Not bad for something that once hung quietly in a crew area, doing its job without much attention. Now it's a historical treasure. Number 5. A bowler's top hat. Unlike many other articles of clothing found from the wreck, this hat wasn't sealed away in a protective bag or stashed in a trunk. It lay exposed on the ocean floor for over 80 years, yet somehow managed to hold its shape. That alone makes it remarkable because usually, clothes and fabric usually get worn out fast underwater, especially without protection. So, the fact that this bowler hat had survived for that long and was still in surprisingly good condition is quite a shocker. When divers first spotted the hat resting against the silt, many thought it was nothing more than debris, but upon closer inspection, the bowler's curved crown and narrow brim were unmistakable. The discovery instantly created a powerful image. This wasn't just an object, but a reminder of the very people who once walked the Titanic's decks. Some researchers speculate that it could have been swept along corridors by underwater currents, eventually settling in a calmer part of the wreck, where it remained undisturbed. Others believe the cold, pressurized environment of the deep Atlantic helped preserve the fibers, preventing total decay. Its survival almost feels symbolic, a small relic standing resilient against time and tragedy. For historians, the hat became a tangible connection to the human stories overshadowed by the enormity of the disaster. Holding on to such an artifact evokes the haunting thought of all the clothing, personal effects, and lives that never resurfaced. The hat is believed to have belonged to Henry Sleeper Harper, a wealthy first-class passenger. Harper made it off the ship alive, boarding Lifeboat 3 alongside his wife, his manservant, and even his prized Pekingese dog named Sun Yat-sen. It's not clear how the hat got separated from him, but somewhere during the panic, as passengers rushed to escape, it was likely lost, left behind in a hallway, blown from a deck, or dropped in the chaos. Decades passed, and it remained there, nearly forgotten. Then, in 1993, deep-sea explorers combing the wreck came across it. Despite decades underwater, the hat remained surprisingly intact. Number 4. A first-class dinner menu. This wasn't just any menu. This was from the last first-class dinner served on the Titanic, on the night of the wreckage. It's hard to imagine paper surviving underwater for over a century, yet here it is, water-stained and a little worn, but still readable. It was found tucked inside a survivor's pocketbook that had been lost in the ruins and buried in silt. Somehow, this print barely in one piece made it out. The thought that someone once held this very menu while sitting in the grand dining saloon, unaware of the fate awaiting them just hours later, makes it almost ghostly to behold. Each dish listed reflects the sheer luxury of first-class life, a stark contrast to the chaos that would soon unfold. Experts believe that menus like this one capture more than just food. They capture a moment in time, a glimpse into a vanished world. The faint stains on the paper could have been from spilled wine or seawater, an unspoken reminder of the night's tragedy. To hold it is to bridge past and present, feeling both the opulence and the heartbreak tied to that voyage. Collectors and historians alike describe it as one of the most haunting Titanic artifacts ever recovered. The menu reads like a gourmet event for the wealthy. It was a selection of meals ranging from oysters to sirloin of beef with horseradish cream, followed by a selection of sides and desserts, including Victoria pudding, ice cream, and apricot bordelu. There were even peaches set in chartreuse jelly, a detail that feels so specific and fancy. It is the only known menu to exist from that day the Titanic sailed across the Atlantic, since most menus that were salvaged were dated from the evening of April 14th, before the ship sank. In 2023, British auction house Henry Aldridge and Son Limited, an auction house that has a dedicated department to the sale of Titanic artifacts and memorabilia, sold and auctioned it for £83,000, which is over $102,000. Number 3. A deck bell. While it might not be as fascinating as the others, the deck bell holds a high significance to the Titanic. It wasn't a decoration piece that hung on the ship. It actually had a real and important task of alerting the sailors and passengers to potential danger. But this time, the bell couldn't save them from the disaster that befell them that night. On the night of April 14, 1912, that bell was in the hands of Frederick Fleet, one of the men stationed at the front of the ship. It was a dark, calm, and cold night, probably why no one was really able to spot the gigantic piece of ice ahead of them. Fleet's role as a lookout was a lonely and heavy burden, standing high above the deck with only the moonlight and silence of the Atlantic to keep him company. When he finally spotted the iceberg looming like a black mountain in the water, panic surged through him as he knew precious seconds were already lost. He rang the bell 3 times with urgency, the metallic clang echoing across the bow as the warning shot through the night. Below, crew members scrambled to react, but the sheer size and speed of the ship left little room for maneuver. The bell's chime, once a tool of caution, now became the haunting soundtrack to a tragedy in motion. Survivors later recalled the eerie silence after the impact, and some claimed they could still hear the faint echo of that bell ringing in their minds. For Fleet, that sound would be etched in memory forever, a reminder of both his duty and the limits of human response against fate. The bell was not just metal and rope, it became a symbol of the last desperate attempt to avert catastrophe. By the time Fleet spotted it, the Titanic was already too close. He reached for the bell and rang it 3 times, letting everyone know that something was directly in their path. Even though Fleet managed to survive the disaster, his bell, however, sank with the ship. It stayed underwater for 75 years before it was recovered and then finally brought to the surface in 1987. It was believed that this bell was the last sound to be heard from the Titanic. The bell is now on display at the Titanic Museum in Massachusetts. Number 2. Fine Chinese plates. These weren't any plates you could have in homes or any restaurant. The dishes were designed with elegance in mind, decorated with delicate gold trim and the restaurant's distinct crest. These plates, which were made by Spode, have been the finest of English china for centuries, producing beautiful and elegant pieces. They were made for the elite, for guests who paid extra to dine away from the main first-class saloon. This was where the social elite gathered over multi-course meals to enjoy not just the meal but the art of fine dining. Imagine the candlelight glinting off the golden rims as aristocrats and millionaires shared stories of business, exploration, and empire. The plates held oysters, filet mignon, and delicacies prepared by some of the finest chefs of the era, each dish a statement of wealth and refinement. Survivors later recalled the hushed sophistication of this exclusive dining room, where the clink of cutlery and laughter of the privileged few echoed against lavish decor. In that very moment, few could imagine the fate awaiting them just hours later. When the iceberg struck, these very plates that once carried luxury became silent witnesses, tumbling into the cold depths with the ship. It was such a luxury class at the time, as these china were only found in luxury ships like the Britannic, the Olympic, and, of course, the Titanic. The china, which included Spode dishes with the White Star Line logo, was reserved for first-class passengers of the Titanic. They were also treated to a 10-course dinner at the a la carte restaurant hours before tragedy struck. The plates, which were decorated with a blue wreath, were clearly dotted with the letters OSNC, which is Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, the company that owned the ship. What's surprising is how many of them were found intact, lying gently on the ocean floor, arranged neatly. Some were stacked together, likely still in the storage areas of the ship. Others were discovered spread out, their edges worn by time but their designs still clear. These fine dishes were recovered from what was thought to be the debris of the a la carte restaurant. Number 1. The Grand Staircase Cherub. Recovered in 1987 during a submersible expedition led by RMS Titanic Incorporated, this bronze statue is one of the few surviving pieces from the ship's legendary first-class staircase. It's believed to have originally adorned a light fixture on one of the staircase landings. Though there's some debate about exactly where it was placed, many experts think it came from the upper landing of the grand staircase. It's smaller than the cherubs that stood on the main levels, suggesting it likely perched higher up where the design was a little more understated, yet no less refined. When divers first brought the statue into the light, they described the moment as eerily moving, as if the spirit of Titanic's grandeur had resurfaced for the first time in decades. Many speculated about the chaos of the sinking that might have ripped it from its pedestal, sending it tumbling down the staircase into the depths. The fact that it survived intact, despite the violent implosion of the ship's interiors, feels like a stroke of fate. To touch this cherub is to touch the same object that once glowed warmly under Titanic's glass dome, illuminating the footsteps of the wealthiest passengers in history. The cherub itself is missing its torch and its left foot, likely lost when it was torn from its mount during the ship's violent sinking. Still, even in its damaged state, it carries the elegance and attention to detail that made the Titanic's interiors so unforgettable. The cherub, which was made out of bronze and once polished to a golden sheen, was not just a decorative piece on the ship. It symbolized the luxury, grace, and the wealth of first-class life aboard the ship. Apart from the grand staircase being a showpiece, it was also a central gathering point for the ship's most elite passengers. Stretching several decks, it was designed with carved wood paneling, wrought iron railings, and ornate glass domes. At every landing, Finely crafted details filled the space, including statues like this cherub, which held lamps that cast a soft glow across the polished floors. To be able to see or even have the privilege of holding this cherub is to hold a piece of that lost world. While many artifacts recovered from the Titanic offer insight into the passengers' lives, this cherub gives us a rare glimpse into the ship's very design. And even now, over a century later, this small bronze figure remains one of the most powerful connections we have to that grand staircase and the not-so-mighty ship and the lives that were once on it. Which of these artifacts did you find the most surprising or fascinating? And if there are other important artifacts that we didn't mention but you think deserve recognition, be sure to share them in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss one of our uploads. And if you enjoyed this video, click on the next video on your screen to keep exploring more content just like this.